Tonight we're going to look at some of the more classic arguments and evidences presented in high school and college textbooks for the general theory of evolution. Now, one of those, of course, is vestigial organs. Now, as the name implies, a vestigial organ is supposed to be an organ that is a vestige or a leftover from a previous evolutionary stage when the organ was more necessary. For example, we have the appendix down here, which is rather small. In some herbivorous animals, that can be very large and actually serves a function in helping to digest cellulose. For example, grazing animals have to digest cellulose in grass. And so the idea is, well, we don't eat a lot of grass now, but we've evolved higher, and so we don't need this. It's kind of a disappearing organ, just a vestige left over from when we needed it in the past in our evolutionary history, but we don't need it now. The problem with vestigial organs is if we can show that they actually have a useful purpose, then they're not useless vestiges. The argument falls apart, in fact, if they have a use. And here in Wikipedia, they pointed out that indeed the so-called useless appendix does have a very important purpose, and that is that it is a safe house of storage for beneficial bacteria for your colon. So if you have a serious bout of diarrhea or dysentery, you can lose those beneficial bacteria out of your colon. And if you're not in a place where you can get those supplements, which in our modern society is a lot easier to do, but if you're out in the woods or in the wilderness somewhere, you have a bout of dysentery, you could have a problem reintroducing those good beneficial bacteria to your colon. And that's what this is really all about. It is a safe house of storage there in the appendix that reintroduces that good bacteria to help you have good colon health. So it is a useful organ. Now, you don't use it all the time, but it's still useful. Furthermore, the idea that, well, they say, well, some of these vestigial organs, you can cut them out and you still live, so they really obviously are useless vestiges. Well, that's not a very good argument, you see. I could get by with just one leg, just one arm, just one eye, just one ear. I could get by, I could still survive, but you wouldn't say that it's not necessary. If I lose an eye, I don't have very good depth perception. If I lose a leg, I can't get around very well. If I lose an arm, I don't have as much dexterity as I used to have. So just the fact that some of these organs we could cut out and survive doesn't mean that they are useless. We're always impaired because they always have some usefulness. Now, back around the turn of the 20th century, they listed up to 180 vestigial organs supposedly left over in man from his evolutionary history. Can you imagine having all of them removed? Yeah, well, not only be very expensive operations, but in some cases, removal would cause you to die. But in many other cases, you would in fact be impaired. Every one of these organs has now been shown to have a useful purpose, and you don't have to take my word for it, a creationist. S.R. Skadden, the notable evolutionist, in thoroughly examining this clear back in the 1980s, he said the vestigial organs provide no evidence for evolutionary theory, because we now know they all have a useful purpose and therefore are not useless vestiges. Now here we're going to be looking at anatomical homology. Homology means the study of similar things or similarities. And so they say, well, look at all these different creatures, the salamander, the crocodile, man, bird, the bat, and the horse. They all have these same bones, the humerus, the radius and ulna, carpals and metacarpals, and the phalanges, and they have simply been modified to work in a different way in different creatures. And this shows, because they all have the same bones that have simply changed supposedly over time by evolution, therefore this proves evolution. Now, the problem is that creation also predicts that there would be similarities from a common designer. And a common designer would, of course, not reinvent the wheel every time he needs to make a design that's going to work in a different application. For example, the wheel is a fantastic invention for transportation. In most applications, it works very well. But you don't try to reinvent some other type of means of locomotion. When the wheel works really good, you simply modify it to work in different applications. So you have different type of wheel for a trailer, and a different type of wheel for a cart, different type of wheel for a train, different type of wheel for automobiles or for heavy earth-moving vehicles or for skateboards. They all have the basic wheel design, but it's been modified to work in a different application. And that's what we see here. A common designer that created these bones that work very well, and they simply have to be modified to work in a different application, just like we use different wheels for different types of vehicles. It makes perfect sense. The real question then, if both theories are predicting similarities, then how do you know which one is true? Well, the one that can explain the most important thing in biology. What is that? The origin of information and machines. Two things that never in the history of the world have ever been proven by experiment to arise except by intelligent design and intervention. We never see them arise by time and chance, natural laws of chemistry and physics. And mathematically, chemically, physically, thermodynamically, we know, based on proven laws, that they cannot, and that's why they do not. So we can show where you get information. At the molecular level, that's what makes life tick. Information stored in DNA, like a blueprint. You have all kinds of a complex biosynthetic mechanism, complicated chemical machines, in effect, more complex than any machines we've ever made, that can read that blueprint, understand it, translate it into a different language, the language of RNA, and then translate it into a third language, the language of proteins, which is a language of structure and function and regulation. So it's all about information that somebody thought up to specify how all this complex chemistry and biochemistry, growth, maintenance, eventual reproduction of living creatures, all of this has to take place. Somebody thought out how to make it all work. I mean, if we went into a modern programmed factory where they have, robots that have been programmed to work on an assembly line and do everything right, do everything decently and in order, you wouldn't say, well, gee, look what happened by time and chance and natural laws of chemistry and physics. People would call you insane. But we look at the far greater complexity in the world of biology, even in a so-called simple single cell, which is more complex than anything man's ever dreamed of creating, much less succeeded at. And there it happened by time and chance because we don't want there to be an intelligent author who put the blueprint there, an intelligent designer who put the machines that can read the blueprint and understand it and build things based on the specifications of the blueprint. So we can explain not only the similarity, but the most important things in biology, the origin of information and the origin of molecular machines. If you can't explain that, you really have nothing significant to say in the world of biology today. This need to explain information and machines at the molecular level was not even known in Darwin's day. So his theory has simply been caught up to by the advance of science, and a stake has been driven through its heart by what we know to be fact today. We reject evolution not on the basis of what we don't know, but on the basis of what we do know, what has been proven, what is established fact, what is proven laws, and the abject lack of any experimental evidence in the history of the world to show that either machines or information can arise by any kind of naturalistic, unintelligent process. So now let's go on to a different form of homology, or similarities, and this is dealing with the question of similarities in biochemicals in life, in this case, cytochrome C, which is a catalytic enzyme involved in a lot of important metabolic processes in all types of plants and animals. Cytochrome C, very important catalytic enzyme. Now, it's a protein, and proteins are like long chains, and each link in the chain is a different one of 20 alpha amino acids. And so you count the number from the beginning to the end, so each link has a number, and you have 20 different alpha amino acids. You could start with phenylalanine, alanine, protein, glycine, glutamic acid, etc., and they all have their position at a specific number in the chain. They're similar, all the cytochromes are similar, but there are a few percentage differences in which amino acids are in which position on that particular molecule. And so the more differences there are, they say the bigger percentage difference that you have between the different molecules. The prediction of evolution is like a protein clock, that the more things evolved, the more different their structure of proteins became because they're changing over time, and so are the protein structures. So in the case of the dogfish, its cytochrome C should be closest to its fellow fish. It would not expect it to be as close to something more highly evolved like a reptile. And so it fits the prediction here. There's more percent difference for the turtle, a reptile, than there is between the fish. It gets a little bigger difference with a bird, the penguin, and it should continue this way, through mammals. It should be getting more and more big difference the further you get from the fish. But instead of fitting the evolutionary pattern, it actually cuts back. And we find that the chicken, a bird, is actually closer than its fellow bird, the penguin, and then it comes back to mammals. It's supposed to be some of the most highly evolved creatures in the world, and the rabbit is actually closer to this than these up here. It should be going in this direction like this, and even higher mammals, like the horse, it should be way over here, but instead it cuts back. So it doesn't follow an evolutionary pattern. I believe this is because God created these molecules to work in different organisms, and they didn't have to fit an evolutionary pattern. They don't have to follow an evolutionary prediction. They simply are different, programmed by the Creator to work in the different biochemistry of the different organisms, and their similarity or dissimilarity is simply not an issue. The issue is that they work. Now then, this is from the book Evolution, A Theory in Crisis by Dr. Michael Denton. Dr. Michael Denton is a self-avowed evolutionist agnostic, and yet he has written one of the most devastating critiques of evolution that you could ever read. And his idea was that I don't have a better theory than Darwin's theory, but we need to get rid of Darwin's theory because it's so full of holes, it has so much trouble. I already have one. Thank you. It has so much trouble that we need to just get it out of the way so we can come up with a better theory. So he wrote this book to destroy Darwinian evolution, and he does a great job of it. If you want a book for someone to read who's a skeptic who will not read a book written by a creationist, you can't get one better than Evolution, A Theory in Crisis by Dr. Michael Denton. He's a PhD in molecular biology and an MD as well, so he's highly qualified. But one of the things he points out in his book, again, is that this biological clock idea doesn't hold up. They cherry pick a few that seem to fit the evolutionary idea, and then they ignore all the ones that contradict it. That, of course, is not education, that's indoctrination, that's censorship. So in this case, the bacterial cytochrome should be closest to its fellow single-celled creature, the yeast. And yet, in this whole spectrum, the biggest percent difference is between the two single-celled creatures, something you would not expect. And the least difference, only 64%, is between a higher mammal and this bacterial cytochrome. Again, exactly the opposite of what evolution would predict. But contradictions like this are not put in the textbooks. They're deliberately censored so that they can make it look like this type of evidence holds up all the time, but they simply censor that which does not. Another example out of Dr. Denton's book is lamprey, and its sequence difference should, of course, be closest to the fish, and then get more and more different as it goes through the evolutionary progression to human. But notice the actual least difference is between the highest evolved creature and the lamprey. Exactly the opposite of what it should be according to evolutionary prediction. In this case, with the fish, a carp, again, we should see a progression from the reptiles, or the amphibian to reptile, to bird, to mammal, and higher mammal. Instead, they're all pretty much equidistant. They're all pretty much the same percentage difference. No progression of evolution at all. Here again, this may mystify the evolutionist, but it doesn't bother a creationist. God created the biochemistry to work in different organisms. It was not designed to follow an evolutionary pattern, and of course it does not. Now, molecular trees, so-called. In the 25th September issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, colleagues at the University of California, Irvine, show that the molecular clock could be ripe for the pawn shop. Molecular clocks in general are much more erratic than previously thought and practically useless to keep accurate evolutionary time. Yeah, because they contradict all over the place if, like Paul Harvey says, you look at the rest of the story. Not just the ones they cherry pick, but the whole spectrum, there's a lot of contradiction. Now, one of the major arguments that people have been brainwashed with is the idea that there's less than 2% difference between the DNA of a chimpanzee and a human being. And they say, well, this is dead ringer proof that we have to be closely related to chimpanzees is proof that they're our closest evolutionary cousin. It's proof that evolution is a fact. Really, you always want to ask the question, where did the data come from? And the original data came back in last millennium, back in the 20th century, way back then, you know. And it was a very flawed and really biased study because they took strands of DNA between humans and chimps, and if they could see that they weren't properly aligning, there wasn't a closeness in the similarity of the nucleotide sequence, they would throw away the ones that they could see were not closely similar, and the ones that were, they kept. And then they analyzed just those. A biased cherry picking. I mean, why would we even listen to something like that? When we find out how they did it, it's ridiculous. So that was back when we had not got a full elucidation of the human genome and the chimpanzee genome. And so it was very little evidence. It was very carefully picked and very biased. So that's where they got this figure. The question is, now that we have so much more data, so much more precisely, has this held up over time? Is there really only about a 1 or 2% difference between the DNA of humans and chimpanzees? And the answer is no. The more we've looked at the data, the more big differences we have found that do not fit the evolutionary prediction. But it's not just DNA, also other biochemistry. For example, insulin, a hormone. The insulin in man is closer to the pig than it is to the chimpanzee. Again, you would expect it to be much closer to the chimpanzee, our alleged closest relative. Lysosome, which is a tear enzyme, it's closer to man and the chicken than it is to the chimpanzee. Again, not what you would expect. Milk chemistry, man is closer to the donkey than the chimpanzee. Well, that one man said, I believe that because, it means we're more closely related to jackasses than anything else, and that's the human problem. But I guess blood-specific gravity, man is closer to the frog than he is to the monkey, again contradicting the evolutionary prediction. And a cytochrome C sequence, man is actually closer to the sunflower, a plant, than the sunflower is to a mold. And of course the mold and the sunflower should be much closer related than to the highest creature evolved, they claim, human beings. So there's a lot of deception there in that regard, and that they don't look at the whole broad spectrum. But this one that they have harped on for all these decades now has been blown to oblivion by the advance of science. Notice this evolutionist geneticist says you have to take account of the fact that we also share about 50% of our DNA with bananas. And that doesn't make us half bananas, either from the waist up or the waist down. Now, why does a plant like a banana have so many genes in common with human beings? Well, because a common designer put us in a common environment, and we have to function in this environment. And therefore, metabolic processes that work in this environment have to have some similarities, or they just wouldn't be able to function in the environment we live in. Same is true of many other animals. They live in the same environment, breathe the same air, eat the same food, drink the same water, and have very similar metabolic needs, and therefore there's a lot of similarity in the protein and in the genetics as well. But it doesn't necessarily mean a evolutionary affiliation. It's because of, again, a common designer designing these things to function in the same environment. But when we look more closely, the evolutionists say, whoa, we're too close for comfort, for the creationists and everything. Believe it or not, now this was, I believe, at the Melbourne Museum in Australia, in this display at the museum, it said, believe it or not, our DNA is nearly identical to a chimpanzee's. Less than 2% of our DNA differs from theirs. These tiny differences in DNA have caused large differences in appearance and behavior. But our DNA reminds us of how closely related we really are. Well, what if the DNA isn't so close after all? Then this whole argument is blown to oblivion. They're saying we're closely related because the DNA is close. Well, what if it turns out they were wrong? It was based on biased, bigoted evidence, and now that we have more complete evidence, it's shot to oblivion. You think they're going to print a retraction and say, we're sorry, we deceived you for all these decades? Not likely. Now over here, they say DNA studies have altered our view of human evolution. They show that humans are apes. There is no missing link. Well, that's one way to get rid of the problem. We can't find missing links legitimately in the fossil record. Well, we just declare ourselves to be apes, and we don't have to worry about it, do we? It's kind of amazing that our other ape brethren don't build skyscrapers and space shuttles and all kinds of computers and things like that. There's kind of a bigger difference, I think, between us and the alleged ape brethren, and that difference also shows up in the DNA. Notice a recent report in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences suggests that the similarity of DNA between chimp and humans is 95% rather than 98%. So more than double difference, and this is just in one particular area, that of indels, meaning insertion and deletion nucleotides. So when they put the DNA of chimpanzees and humans side by side, and they look at where the nucleotides match up, sometimes you have an insertion. In other words, one of them has a nucleotide in there, the other one doesn't have at that position. Or a deletion, the other one is missing that particular nucleotide at that position that the other one does have. So insertion and deletion, indels, adds up to 5% difference. Well, that's a lot. That's many books worth of information. How is all that difference supposed to be evolved in a mere 6 million years? But it gets worse. For years, chimpanzees were considered to be only about 1% genetically dissimilar to humans. A recent gene splicing study revealed a 6 to 8% difference. A 2003 study revealed a 13% difference in our respective immune systems, and another study revealed a 17% difference in gene expression in our cerebral cortexes. Better genetic technology and increasing knowledge of the critical function of non-coding regions, formerly referred to as junk DNA, appear to be revealing a trend. Now, the trend they've revealed, again, is that we didn't have vestigial organs. What was vestigial? Man's knowledge. As science advanced, we found out all these organs have functions and therefore are not useless and have a design purpose. Same with DNA. We have all this non-coding DNA that didn't code for proteins. They say, well, it must be leftover junk. It's vestigial DNA left over from our evolutionary history since it doesn't code for DNA. But then they found out, it may not code for DNA, but it has a very important regulatory function. So important that if you cut it out or mess with it, you end up with cancer or other deadly diseases, or you just die. I mean, it's not window dressing, it's not junk. And that means more than 90% of it now, getting more and more close to 100%, has been demonstrated to have a useful purpose. Again, it's not vestigial, it's man's knowledge was vestigial. Man's knowledge was imperfect. Now that we know how important these are, and we count that in the percentage difference because it is very important in its regulatory function, then there's much bigger differences than we ever realized before, as is pointed out here. Now, Dr. David Page at the Whitehead Institute for Biochemical Research, he is an evolutionist, and he said, Dr. Page admitted that the Y chromosomes of chimps and humans are, quote, horrendously different from each other. Dr. Page's team found that the chimp Y chromosome has only 2/3 as many distinct genes or gene families as the human Y chromosome, and only 47% as many protein-coding elements as humans. Furthermore, more than 30% of the chimp Y chromosome lacks any alignable counterpart on the human Y chromosome. Now, these are very big differences. The more they've looked at it, even at the evolutionists' own data, it appears on the average there appears now to be not close to 1% difference, but on an average about 30% difference between the DNA of humans and the DNA of chimpanzees. Now that's a big, big, big difference from what they were saying before. And it's really bad because that type of difference, they claim, should exist between creatures that are separated by some 300 million years of evolutionary time. That's the kind of big percentage difference you'd expect. But instead, chimpanzees are only supposed to be separated by a mere 6 million years. So again, the data doesn't add up. Anybody who says, hey, we're closely related to chimpanzees, I say, come out of the last millennium when they believed that Tommy rot that was based on a biased, bigoted study, and look at the modern data. It contradicts evolution. We're not closely related, which would be expected because we're separately created by a common designer, but there are big differences that don't fit the evolutionary pattern. Now, Dr. David Page also said, he admits that the, quote, percentage relationship between the human and chimp Y chromosomes has been blown to pieces. Now, there's no close percentage like they predicted they would find. Absolutely contradicts evolutionary prediction. Now, it's the percentage relationship he's saying. He's saying, as far as we're concerned, chimps are still closely related to humans because it doesn't matter what the data says. Who cares about the data? Who cares about science? Who cares about facts? You know, we got to support the theory of evolution. But when anybody says, genetically, we're closely related to chimpanzees, tell them you don't know what you're talking about anymore. Come out of the last millennia into the new millennia and the new data, and you'll realize what the creationists have been saying all along is true. We are not closely related because we were separately created. That's the best explanation. Now, when you use closeness of chemistry, we can find out some amazing things evolved. For example, the watermelon, which is about 97% H2O, must have evolved eventually into the clouds, which are nearly 100% H2O. It must be so because their chemistry is so similar. You know, if similarity proves ancestry, it must be true. And I think we even have some potential intermediates. For example, it may have evolved first into the snow cone, which is about 98% H2O, or perhaps the jellyfish, and then into the cloud, or perhaps vice versa. Who knows? But if closeness of chemistry proves evolutionary ancestry, you can make ridiculous arguments like this. Just because there's a closeness or similarity doesn't necessarily imply an ancestral relationship. Now we're going to come to the fossil record, which is the only record of life from the past that at least preserves some of what happened in the past and for which we would make different predictions based on evolution or creation. Darwin said that there should be innumerable transitional fossils. In fact, you dig into the earth, you find more transitional fossils than complete fossils, according to his theory. But he said in his book, this is the most obvious and serious objection to my theory. we don't find these innumerable transitions that should be there. Now, he didn't throw in the towel. He didn't say, well, obviously my theory's wrong because the evidence doesn't support it. He said, well, we have just a meager sampling of the fossil record. When we get a bigger sampling, all these missing links will show up by the boatload. There'll be millions of them all over the world and in every museum, and my theory will be vindicated. Well, we're now well more than 1.5 centuries past that prediction. Knowledge of the fossil record has increased more than 100-fold. Do we have more than 100 times more transitions now than we had in Darwin's day? No, it's actually worse. Some of the classic examples that were accepted at his time are no longer accepted. So it's actually gotten worse. And he said it was so bad back then, if they didn't find those missing links, he'd have to throw in the towel. I wonder if he were alive today, if he'd hold up to that prediction. Anyway, this is something we should clearly see. If creatures lived and died over millions of years, then some of them in the halfway transitional stages should have died and been preserved. For example, you start out with single cells, and then they go into multiple cell creatures, and then marine invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, apes, finally man. And if these creatures living and dying over millions of years, you'd certainly expect some of them to get preserved. They say, well, we can't find very many because, it takes millions of years. And, okay, well, shouldn't we see it happening today? Well, no, because it takes millions of years, you can't see it. It's so slow. But that's not a valid argument, because if it does take millions of years, then some of it started a few million years ago that will not be destined to be finished until a few million years in the future, and therefore we are in the transitionary period for a lot of these creatures. We should be, and yet we don't find them. You see, evolution is always happening, but it's always happening either too fast or too slow for us to see it. You say, well, why didn't we see it happen back then? Well, it happened so fast back then it didn't leave adequate transitions. Why can't we see it today? Well, it's happening so slow today you can't see it. So it's either too fast or too slow, but when you really want to observe it, which is what science is all about, you can't, because there's always an excuse as to why it can't be done. But that excuse doesn't hold up. We should see it happening today, even if it takes millions of years, because some of it should have started in the past and will not be finished until a few million years in the future. Where are all these transitions? In the fossil record, it is absolute fact that the evolutionists know jolly well that at the higher orders of taxonomy, from the family level, family order class phyla, the gaps are systematic, and they always have been. So we should predict these transitions if evolution is true. If creation is true, they were separately created, and you have horizontal variation within distinct families, like varieties of cats, varieties of dogs, varieties of cattle, varieties of horses. We've known about that for centuries before Darwin was born. But at the family level, we never see one family transform into another, not in the living world or in the fossil record, not indisputably. Now then, the biggest gap and the most lethal gap in the fossil record is in the Cambrian rocks, where they have the Eocambrian problem, which is more than just a problem, it's a fatal stake right through the heart of the theory. From a single cell creature, bacteria, algae, single-celled algae, or phytoplankton, we're supposed to evolve into these multi-million-celled, very complex, very different creatures found in the Cambrian. And we're talking like over 30 different phyla. The phyla are like very big categories right under, the kingdom itself. Plant and animal kingdom, we got the phyla, and then the classes below them. So the phyla that we're in are chordates. That means they have a nerve cord extending from the brain down the back, and we're in a subphyla called vertebrates, meaning we have a vertebral column or a backbone. Now that includes such diverse creatures as fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, apes, and man himself. All those diverse creatures are in that one subphylum of chordates. So 30 plus different types means radically different designs that are very distinct from one another, very, very dissimilar in their designs, and yet they explode on the scene as if somebody spoke them into existence, and boom, there they are, including our own subphylum of vertebrates. Vertebrate fish have been documented in the Cambrian. For a long time they didn't want to admit that, but they've been found so many times they don't dispute it anymore. So how do we go from single cells to multi-million cell creatures of every major phyla and class exploding on the scene? They claim the biggest evolution ever happened in evolutionary history. 66 to 75% of it happened here. No really big classes evolved after this. No, it wasn't that big of changes. So here we have the biggest evolution taking place, so we should see plenty of transitions. Here's where we have the richest fossil record for finding fossils. It's in the Cambrian. We find them like crazy there. So why don't we find these transitions? If we're going from a single cell, it must have evolved into a 2-cell, 3-cell, 4-cell, 5-cell, 10-celled, 100-celled, 1,000-celled, 10,000, 100,000-celled, finally multi-million-celled creature. Where is all the evidence? Well, there should be evidence there because even soft-bodied creatures get preserved. That's what they say, well, the early ones were soft-bodied and they just didn't get preserved. That's why there's a gap. Really, aren't bacteria and algae soft-bodied creatures? Yeah. Yeah, we find them preserved. So why don't we find the multi-celled ones that are just as soft and delicate preserved also? We find jellyfish, worms, snails, soft-bodied creatures. All of the Ediacaran fauna first found in Australia, Ediacara Australia, are soft-bodied. We find them on 5 different continents of the planet. Why don't we find these missing links? There should have been innumerable ones. Biggest evolution ever happened. And the richest portion of the fossil record for both reasons that should be there, and there's nothing. You go from single cells to multi-million cells, nothing in between. Now, they used to say 3 billion years of evolution happened there, but it became so glaringly obvious that with that much time, there should have been so much evidence, and there's none. They decided to change the story, and they changed it to evolution's Big Bang. Not the alleged cosmological Big Bang, but a biological Big Bang. And in Time magazine, that's what they call it, and basically they say that instead of going for 3 billion years of evolution, leaving no evidence, that it happened very rapidly, and they suddenly appear, life got very complicated in just 10 million years. That's what they claim. Well, that of course gets rid of the problem of millions and billions of years of time with no transitions, but even 10 million years is a lot. So they're forced to claim that for hundreds of millions, billions of years, nothing but single-celled creatures, then boom, in just 10 million years, you get all these phyla, radically different body plans, explode on the scene as if somebody spoke them into existence. Now, whether you say it happened slow or fast, and 10 million years is not that fast. Remember, from a chimpanzee to a human, they claim 6 million years, and they claim that there's all kinds of ape men in between. Now, I refute all those in my DVD back there. They're easy to refute. But they claim there's plenty of transitions you can get in that short a time. So here you got an extra 4 million years and even greater amount of evolution. Where's all the transitions? So you can't have your cake and eat it too. Just shortening the time does not get rid of the problem. Furthermore, they don't have a mechanism. Random mutations in natural selection, random changes in any language corrupt and destroy the language. It becomes gibberish. It becomes incommunicable. It doesn't work anymore. So the more mutations you have, whether fast or slow, it doesn't matter. It corrupts the information, leading to extinction. It doesn't lead to evolution. So they claim there was a burst of creativity, but it couldn't have happened by their mechanism. Now then, so they say about 600 million years ago, life suddenly got very complex. Well, how? The mechanism still doesn't work. These things explode on the scene. 10 million years of one changing into another should have left plenty of transitions between every distinct phyla and class, and yet we see, again, nothing. It's a little bit hard to believe. It's a stake through the heart of the theory. I say, look, this problem has killed your theory. There's 2 fatal problems. Number 1, they can't get the first living cell. It's mathematically, chemically, physically, thermodynamically impossible based on everything we know. Every single experiment has failed miserably for generations. They don't even like to talk about experiments anymore. Okay, what's that?
Speak slower.
Oh, speak slower.
You're so excited about the topic, I can't keep up with you.
Okay, I'll try to be a little slower. Got a time limit too, though, so I'll try not to be quite so excited. Anyway, so it is exciting, though, that we have all the evidence in our favor. But the point is that you've got to get all that data there, and there's nothing. All this took place and left absolutely nothing. Let's see if we get there a little better. I've got to not hit this little cord here. So the first fatal problem, there's 2. We can't get the first cell, the first species. If you logically cannot get the first species, the first living cell, it logically cannot evolve into all the other species in the world of biology. It's not a minor problem. It's a stake through the heart. All the chemistry, physics, all the mathematics, all the experiments have failed. If anybody believes it, they believe it in spite of all the evidence against it, which is not a reasonable or scientific position. So that's stake number 1 through the heart. This is number 2. This cuts the head off of their theory. It's inconceivable that you could have all these millions of years of evolution, the biggest evolution in history, 75% of the large-scale evolution ever took place, and leave nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing between single cells and the multi-million cell creatures. Nothing. Nobody has ever found anything. And that's inconceivable if evolution were true. Now they claim, well, they were soft-bodied. That doesn't hold up. They claim we didn't have a good enough sampling. Well, now it's been 150 years. We have tons of fossils, but we don't have the missing links. That hasn't held up either. So the lame excuses have not held up. And if you have a theory with a stake through its heart and its head cut off, then it's a fatally weakened theory. I tell them, fix these fatal flaws regarding the first living cell and this huge gap that shouldn't be there if evolution is true. Supply evidence to show that that's credible, and then you have earned a right to come to the table and discuss biological origins. Otherwise, you have a fatally flawed theory twice, and I don't need to listen to it. Come back when there's no more fatal flaws. Why should anyone listen to a theory that has two fatal flaws? Well, they never come back because in all this time and effort, they've never been able to solve those two fatal flaws with the theory. Now then, notice they say complex creatures with teeth and tentacles and claws and jaws materialized with the suddenness of apparitions. I would say yes, with the suddenness of creation. They have all these different body parts, different anatomy. Everything's radically different, and yet there's no trace of ancestors. It's inconceivable that evolution did it, but creation would predict that lack of transitions. Now then, Valentine and Irwin are both experts on this part of the fossil record, and they say, they're evolutionist experts, if we were to expect to find ancestors to or intermediates between higher taxa, it would be in the rocks of late Precambrian to Ordovician times, when the bulk of the world's higher animal taxa evolved. Yet transitional alliances are unknown or unconfirmed for any of the phyla or classes appearing then. Inconceivable if evolution is true. How could all this happen and leave no evidence? I mean, it's like going into a court of law and the prosecuting attorney says, Your Honor, we want to find this man guilty of capital murder, and we want you to give the judgment right now. And the judge says, well, there's a little problem here. In my court, I actually required there to be some evidence, and you presented no evidence. Do you have any eyewitnesses at the scene of the crime? Well, no, sir, we have no eyewitnesses at all. Do you have any forensic evidence, fingerprints, blood, hair, DNA, anything to connect this man to the scene of the crime? Well, no, Your Honor, we don't have any evidence at all, but we figure he's a criminal genius and he figured out how to do the perfect crime without leaving any evidence. And therefore, since we figure that's how he did it, we wanted you to find him guilty. The judge would say, I'm throwing the book at you because your prejudice against the defendant does not make him guilty. You have nothing to place him at the scene of the crime. You have no forensic evidence to connect him there. You have no motive as to why he would murder this person. You might as well grab somebody off the street and accuse him of murder. You have no evidence. I'm throwing you out of my court and don't come back, ever, unless you have evidence. That's why I tell the evolutionists, don't come back unless you have the evidence, okay? You get rid of these fatal problems, you've earned a right to talk about origins. If you can't get rid of them, I don't want to hear it. I do not have to listen to a theory that has two fatal flaws. Now, Alfred Romer of Harvard, notable evolutionist paleontologist, he said, below this Cambrian strata are the vast thicknesses of sediments in which the progenitors would be expected. In other words, evolutionary missing links. But we do not find them. These older beds are almost barren of life, and the general picture could reasonably be consistent with the idea of special creation, which means supernatural biblical creation. Well, he probably got excommunicated from the evolutionary fraternity for making such an honest statement, but yeah, it does look like creation. It looks like he spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast, and that's why all those different classes and phyla appeared as if out of nothing, because they were spoken into existence by an omnipotent creator, and that's the same thing we see in the living world today, same thing we see in the fossil record. The gaps are there because creation took place. Now, Stephen Gould and Niles Eldridge, both eminent evolutionist paleontologists, they said at the higher level of evolutionary transitions between basic morphological designs, gradualism has always been in trouble, though it remains the quote-unquote official position of most Western evolutionists. Smooth intermediates between Bauplana, which is a German word that means basic construction type or family in the zoological sense, are almost impossible to construct even in thought experiments. There is certainly no evidence for them in the fossil record. Curious mosaics like Archaeopteryx do not count. Well, there you get it from the horse's mouth. It's just not there. They advocated punctuated equilibrium, which basically says there's a lack of transitions because although transitions took place, they did so in small, isolated populations, and therefore there wasn't hardly any transitions existing, and therefore it was unlikely for them to get preserved. So again, it happened, but it happened in just the right way. It didn't leave any evidence. Really. Again, it's like going into the court of law and say, well, Your Honor, we don't have any evidence to convict this man, but we have a lot of theories about how he might have done it. Is that good enough? No, you get the book thrown at you. And that's the same in science. If you're admitting there's no evidence and all you can do is come up with cockamamie, lame excuses as to why there's no evidence, it happened in just the right way, it didn't leave any evidence, you're still admitting there's no evidence. If there is no evidence, there is no case. It's that way in a court of law. Doesn't matter how many excuses you have or why you think the evidence doesn't exist. You either have it or you don't. If you can't present it, you lose. And they've been losing for more than a century and a half when it comes to the fossil record. It has never supported their theory, ever. Now then, in biology, Curtis and Barnes' public school textbook, it says many organisms retain traces of their evolutionary history. For example, the whale retains pelvic and leg bones as useless vestiges. So they claim this is part of the pelvis, this is part of the femur bone. Well, it'd be much more convincing if it actually looked like there was a pelvic girdle there, an actual pelvis, and some articulated leg bones. That would be pretty good evidence, but such has never been found. Now they're claiming again that it's useless. Again, what do you ask? Does it have a useful purpose? If so, it's not a useless vestige. Does it have a useful purpose? Yes, these are there as anchors for very important muscles because whales have to copulate in water, which is not easy to do. And you got to make those muscles work just right, and without having these bones to anchor those muscles in that area, you would lose at the most single important thing in all the world of biology. What's that? Reproduction. If you can't reproduce, that's the end of the line. The species goes extinct. And to say it's unimportant when it contributes to the single most important thing, even according to evolutionary doctrine, reproduction, is just a travesty. Now again, they don't just say it once, they say it twice in many other places. Glencoe Biology, Living Systems, whales have a vestigial pelvis and leg bone. Now, does that look like a pelvis? It doesn't look like it to me. And why isn't it connected to the vertebral column if indeed it is a pelvis? That would be much more convincing, but they don't have it. So they claim it served no purpose. These structures are evidence of the whale's evolution from four-legged, land-dwelling mammals. Well, I don't think so. I think they made much, much better than that, and it does serve a useful purpose. Therefore, it's a design feature. We can argue that stridently. Now then, because whales have been such a problem, supposedly animals struggled to get out of the water onto land, then some of them decided they didn't like it on the land, they evolved back into whales, So they say that the ancestor of whales were four-legged ungulates, meaning pigs, sheep, or cattle. Some say they were wolves. Any four-legged mammal, I guess, would do. But they went back into the water and evolved fins and everything like that to become whales. Now, Phil Gingrich is a recognized evolution of whale expert. He's supposed to be an expert in the evolution of whales. Notice, this is his reconstruction of Pachycetus. Now, cetus means whale, and it was found in Pakistan, thus they get the name Pachycetus, meaning the Pakistan whale or the whale of Pakistan. Notice what he said when he drew this reconstruction. In time and its morphology, Pachycetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later full-fledged whales. Now, you always ask this question whenever they're making an argument based on a fossil that's been found. How much was found? I want to see the physical evidence. How much was actually found? Well, notice only the stippled segments were found. In other words, these dark portions here and here. That's all they found. And yet he feels justified in drawing a picture like this and saying it's perfectly intermediate based on fragmentary evidence. That's just absurd. So you always ask, I want to see what was found. I don't want to see your biased picture of what you think happened back in evolution. Now then, this happens many, many, many times, especially with the evolutionary origin of man. They make extravagant claims based on fragmentary evidence, then they find more evidence, and lo and behold, it wasn't exactly what they thought it was. When they found more than this, they found this, it became very evident the creature looked like this. A four-legged, land-dwelling mammal, a full quadruped that could run. That is not a whale, okay? But lest they lose face, they still call it a whale. Notice, he said all the postcranial bones indicate that pachycetids were land mammals and indicate that the animals were runners with only their feet touching the ground. The first whales were fully terrestrial and were even efficient runners. Well, that's how you save face. It's a fully committed, land-dwelling, four-legged mammal, but we'll call it a whale, lest we have to admit that we never had a whale in the first place. Well, I'll tell you what, if that's a whale, then any four-legged mammal running around is a whale. Pig, sheep, cattle, horses, wolves, whatever you want. There's whales running around all over the place. But I'll tell you what it really is. It's just a whale of a tail. And, you know, we weren't born yesterday, and when they have to say that's a whale, you know they don't have anything worth arguing about. When they're driven to such desperation to call that a whale, and that proves their theory, they have nothing. It is sadly pathetic. Now, here we have ambulocetus. Cetus again means whale, and ambulo means ambulatory or walking. So the name actually means walking whale. Now here again, they reconstruct this in the textbooks. This is what a skeleton is supposed to look like. This is what it's supposed to look like in the flesh. But again, you ask the $64 million question, what is it? I want to see the actual fossil remains. Well, when you ask that, guess what? There ain't much of ambulocetus. Now, especially when you take into the fact that these darker bones here were found 15 feet higher in a different rock layer. And there's no proof they ever even belonged with the rest of the skeleton. When we get rid of these questionable fragments, there isn't a whole lot left of the so-called walking whale. How in the world would they know what it looked like, for goodness sake? But they have no problem drawing pictures that look the way they wanted it to look, according to their evolutionary preconceived ideas. So we have Carroll's whale, the Mesonicid. He did the same thing. He said, well, we found enough evidence it looks like it was an ancient wolf-like creature. Thwaisen's whale we already saw, and of course it was a four-legged land-dwelling mammal which could run with legs. So they're calling these whales. Then we have the ambulocetus. Again, it's drawn this way, but there's simply such fragmentary evidence. There's not enough there to say what in the world the thing really was. But they like to draw pictures, so just any fragment is good enough to do that. When we get down to Rhodocetus, it looks a little more like a real transition. Well, it was a four-legged creature. Now the legs have turned into fins, and its tail is turned into a fluke. And boy, that looks like a pretty legitimate transition. There's only one problem. It's a lie, again. Remember, Gingrich, the alleged whale evolution expert, he was interviewed by a creationist doing research for a creationist book. I believe it was Dr. Werner, not Werner Gitt, but the one who wrote the one on the book on what kind of fossils am I thinking of? Lord, bring it to my memory here. Living fossils, his book on living fossils, okay? He interviewed Gingrich, and he said, I notice you have a model out there, but he says, I notice, you have these fins on the model. Is that really what they look like? And Gingrich, in the interview, on video, admitted, well, you know, we don't really want to change that model, but we did find the appendages, and they really don't look like flippers. In other words, they look more like this, like four-legged land-dwelling mammal. Again, they didn't have flippers like this. Also, they didn't find in the tail section the kind of a ball vertebrae, which is distinct to whales. It allows them to do that up and down motion. It's kind of a ball-shaped vertebrae. They found nothing like that. So they don't know that it had a fluke, and it appears that it had legs and not flippers. But he said, well, we don't want to change the display. Why? Because then everybody'd see they don't have any evidence. So none of these are legitimate until we get down to Basilosaurus, and it's not legitimate either. It looks like, yeah, maybe it had legs and now they've turned into fins, and it has that ball joint and everything. But actually, Basilosaurus, in reality, would be 10 times longer than what they put here. They shrunk it in size to make it look like it fits proportionally with these that it's supposed to have descended from. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that it's radically different in its anatomy to such an extent that it doesn't belong in the branch of whale evolution at all. And you don't have to listen to creationists to hear that. Barbara J. Stahl, who's an expert in vertebrate paleontology, she said, the serpentine form of the body and the peculiar shape of the cheek teeth make it plain that these archaeocetes, like Basilosaurus, could not possibly have been the ancestor of modern whales. And whether it's the anatomy is too radically different, it doesn't even belong on the branch that led to whales, and yet they put it right there at the bottom as if it fits, and they draw it 10 times shorter than what it really was to make it look like it fits. The whole thing is fraud. And yet, we can't get it out of the textbooks. Because even when we try it in court, they say, well, if the scientists support it, you know, the evolutionist scientists support it, it must be true. Well, they have biased, bigoted reasons for supporting it. And Just because scientists believe something doesn't necessarily make it true. They have been wrong many times in the past. Now, in a personal letter from Dr. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, to Luther Sunderland. Sunderland was a creationist who passed away a number of years ago, but he wrote to Dr. Colin Patterson. He said, I read your book, Evolution. He said, I noticed you work at the British Museum of Natural History that has the largest assemblage of fossils of any museum in the world, even more than the American Museum of Natural History in New York. That's because it used to be the sun never set on the British Empire, and they grabbed everything everywhere they could, all over the world. So he said, here you have all these fossils at your fingertips. You write this book, and you don't anywhere show either a drawing or a photograph of a transitional creature, either living or fossil, in your whole book. He says, why is that? Well, Dr. Colin Patterson wrote back a very honest answer. He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustrations of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Remember, he's an expert paleontologist and an evolutionist. He says he doesn't know of any that would really qualify. So, he says, yet Gould and the American Museum people, meaning Niles Eldridge and others, are hard to contradict when they say that there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Wow. How many times do you hear that from an expert evolutionist? Not many of them are honest enough to admit that, but he did. Now, that means we have quite a few strikes against Darwin's theory of evolution. Strike number one, Darwinian evolution is impossible to observe according to Theodosius Dobzhansky, the greatest evolutionist of the 20th century. He said, where it really counts, at the family level and higher, the gaps are systematic, but it's precisely at that level where it takes millions of years for big changes to be observed. Therefore, no human scientist can ever observe real Darwinian evolution because we don't live for millions of years to observe it. Okay, they say, well, it's not our fault. Well, it also means it's not a scientifically testable theory. If you can't observe it, test it, and repeat it under controlled conditions, it's not scientific. And they can't call it a law of biology or a law like the law of gravity or the second law of thermodynamics or anything. Laws are deduced by experiments that always give the same results, and you can see it and test it. Everybody can test it and get the same result. But when it comes to this, you can't even see it no matter what. It's not in the fossil record, it's not seen in the living world, and it supposedly happens, but it takes millions of years so you can never see it. And he admits it's impossible to observe it, therefore it's impossible for it to be a scientific theory, because scientific theories are observable and testable. Strike number two, the mutation selection mechanism, according to no less an authority than Stephen Gould of Harvard University, who prior to his death in 2002 was perhaps the world's leading spokesman for evolution, he said that that mechanism is, quote, effectively dead. He admitted random changes in the DNA language just cripples and garbles the information, makes things go downhill, it doesn't make it better, we gotta find a better mechanism. But he never did by the time he passed away in 2002. Stephen Jay Gould, however, did become a creationist. How many of you knew that? Anybody know that? Well, guess what? When you die, you meet your maker. We all become creationists, okay? So he is now a creationist, I'll guarantee you, but it's a little too late. He spurned the Creator, spurned his love, spurned his grace, all his life, believed this ridiculous lie of evolution and taught others to believe it. So he no doubt had a horrific accountability. But we all become creationists in the end. I tell people, you know how to become a creationist before you die, and know the Creator and love him because he loves you. But thirdly, the third strike is that there's not a single watertight transitional fossil, as we just quoted with Dr. Colin Patterson, formerly of the British Museum of Natural History. Now, there's a handful that they will argue about, but they're so questionable that they argue amongst themselves whether or not they're legitimate. You need a lot more than just a handful of questionable examples. There should be boatloads in every museum if his theory is true, just like he said. And so instead we have, well, the punctuated equilibrium where it happens in just the right way, where it never really hardly gets any evidence, and therefore it happened in just the right way, it didn't leave any evidence, and that would be thrown out of any court of law, but we're supposed to believe it's science. Any way you want to look at it, they just do not have the evidence. So in desperation, Niles Eldridge of American Museum of Natural History, he said, well, look, we don't have the evidence in most of the fossil record. He says, I know, I'm a paleontologist, but he says, we do have it one place, and that's up here, from an alleged ape-like ancestor to man. That's where we've got the goods, and that proves the theory. Well, if this does not hold up under cross-examination, the whole theory collapses like a house of cards. Now, basically, again, here, it's very easy to refute. For one thing, if this is true, we have many examples of complete or nearly complete fossils of apes. We have even more examples of ancient men, complete or nearly complete fossils. And you can tell jolly well if it's an ape, and you can tell jolly well if it's a man. But when it comes to the ape man, half ape, there's this twilight zone of extreme fragmentary evidence where the rest gets made up by their fertile imaginations in drawings. Notice these are drawings, they're not photographs. They can't seem to find ape men running around to photograph. And we don't find them in the fossil record, but they sure can draw pictures of them based on fragmentary evidence. Now, when you get a nearly complete skeleton, it's a problem for them, because by that point, you can jolly well tell if it's an ape or a man, and it always is. And now we have that type of evidence really with the Australopithecines, Lucy and her kind. They were just an extinct form of ape. I mean, we have enough of the anatomy now, we can say categorically it was nothing but a different type of ape. There are 3 living apes today, the orangutans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. There apparently was a 4th great ape in the past that went extinct, but extinction is not evolution. If it was alive today, it'd be put in the zoo just with the other of its ape brethren, and it would not be seen to be anything but an ape. Now remember, apes are not even proof for evolution, even by their own theory. They claim apes and man branched off on the tree of evolution. One branch led to humans, and one branch led to apes. So the apes are going on their branch in their own trajectory that never led to human beings. So finding apes in the fossil record or living today is not proof of human evolution because they're not even on a branch that led to evolution. You have to have something on the human branch that's half ape and half man. And when you ask for that, you get all this fragmentary stuff where they love to draw pictures, but there's really no substance. We have frauds like Piltdown Man and Nebraska Man. We have others that really are human, like Homo erectus and Neanderthal, but they call them ape men because they need some candidates. But we can argue very strenuously those were genuine humans. So the ones they've made the biggest arguments on again are the Australopithecines. Austral in Latin means southern, like Australia, the southern continent. Pithecus in Greek means ape. So it's a compound Latin-Greek word which means southern ape. It was when Dr. Raymond Dart first found a specimen in southern Africa. He gave it the appropriate name, southern ape. He didn't say ape man, he didn't say hominid. He said it's just an ape. And he was right. Clear back there in 1924, he was right. It's just a different type of ape. Now, in the reconstruction, they give it an ape-like face and skull, which they have to because it's a grossly ape-like skull. Nobody questions that. Everybody says from the neck up, all the Australopithecines are nothing but apes. But they claim from the neck down, it evolved into man first, its body, and then later its brain evolved into man, kind of reverse of what you'd expect. But at any rate, in this representation at the Chicago Museum, they have an ape-like skull, but they put whites in the eyes. Currently living apes have no whites in their eyes. Their eyes are completely dark. Now, eyes are not preserved in the fossil record. How do they know it had whites in its eyes like a human? They don't know that. There's no science to that, but they put it there as a psychological weapon to make it look more human. It looks more like it has a soul, a thinking mind, a more human visage. But there's no way to know that it had whites in its eyes. It, again, is propaganda. Now, we have found these missing extremity bones. When we found the chest, apes tend to have a conical-shaped chest, whereas humans are more barrel-shaped. Guess what? Lucy has a conical-shaped chest, just like other apes. Her pelvis region and everything appears very ape-like. When we finally found the hands, they have long, curved fingers and knuckle-walking type of wrists that lock so they can walk on their knuckles. So as we found more and more of this missing evidence, it became very clear the long, curved fingers are not portrayed here. This is a human hand, but we now know it looked very, very ape-like and not human-like at all. Also, locking wrists. If she was supposed to be able to walk as good as a modern human, they claim, why did she still have wrist-walking anatomy, as if she was walking on her knuckles like a knuckle-walking ape? Good question. The wrong talus angle, which means the angle of the bone here connecting the lower ankle to the foot. It was the right angle for shimmying up, for climbing up trees. Wake you up there if you're asleep. A lot of the time, but not for habitually walking upright in a truly human fashion. Now, chimpanzees can occasionally walk upright, but they do it in a very awkward ape-like manner. They cannot walk in a true human manner, and they don't do it very long because it's not very comfortable. They simply don't have the anatomy for habitual bipedal locomotion, which is what we have, two-legged habitual motion, and they don't have the right balance mechanism in their ear for it either. Finally, we found her foot, and the foot is very ape-like. They give it a hairy human foot here. That's what it looks like. A human foot, what did it actually look like? Well, it actually looks like this. Grossly ape-like, not human-like at all. So did they change the representation? No. When this anatomy professor complained, hey, the new findings show that all this is wrong, Why don't you change it? They said sanctimoniously, well, we don't want to cause the taxpayers so much money to change the display. Well, I guess it's better to use the money to lie to them and to deceive them and to portray something that isn't even true according to the evidence. That is not a very good use of tax money. But of course, if they got rid of it, then everybody realized they don't have anything. So Charles Oxnard, former professor of anatomy and anthropology at the University of Chicago, then at USC for a while, currently he's a professor in Australia. He has done multivariate analyses starting back in the 70s. Nowadays, very sophisticated. He'll take the bone, like say the pelvis of monkeys, apes, the Australopithecines, and man. They'll rotate them 360 degrees, scan them with lasers, get a precise three-dimensional digital picture with measurements, put it in the computer. Then they compare them back and forth to see how similar or dissimilar they are. Do that with all the bones. He says, now we have enough bones from the Australopithecines that we can make very definitive judgments. And although an evolutionist expert in this field, he said, the Australopithecines known over the last several decades are now irrevocably removed from a place in the evolution of human bipedalism, meaning walking upright on two legs in a human fashion, possibly from a place in a group any closer to humans than to African apes, and certainly from any place in the direct human lineage. Now, he's a confirmed evolutionist. He's not saying this because he wants to. He's just saying if we go with the facts, like Joe Friday used to say, just the facts, ma'am. He said if we go with the facts, it's indisputable these have no place in the human lineage. They're nothing but a fourth type of great ape that went extinct, and the anatomy proves it. Now, just several years ago, Science magazine here, publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, came out with this creature that was found, Ardipithecus ramidus. Now, Ardipithecus in Ethiopian means root of the ground ape. In other words, these are supposed to be the first apes coming down out of the trees, beginning to walk on the ground, turning into humans. Now, as we can see, very fragmentary evidence. They had enough of the bone fragments of the skull to realize it was just an ape-like skull. But the chest is missing, a lot of the pelvis is missing. They do have enough leg bones, though, and foot bones to be very telling. Now, how did they reconstruct this? Well, first of all, does anybody see any problem with this hand here? Anybody notice something bad about that hand? Well, I'll tell you what's bad about it. It's not a hand. It's a foot. It looks like a hand. That's what's wrong with it. That is a foot bone, foot bones, and this is a human foot bone. You see much similarity? Notice the chimpanzee is a lot closer to the human, but has very long curved toes and a prehensile big toe that acts like a thumb so it can grab tree limbs just like a hand. When you have feet that look like hands, they weren't designed for walking on the ground. They were designed to live an arboreal lifestyle. In other words, in the trees almost all the time, grabbing tree limbs with all four appendages. That's what it's designed for. Yet they have tried to put it intermediate between chimpanzees and humans as being more human-like than a chimpanzee. And its anatomy is grossly ape-like, actually more monkey-like than anything. It does not belong there, but they're desperate to have something. Now then, in the reconstruction, it's just amazing. I watched the video on this, and the artist was making a sculpture, and he was also drawing these pictures, and the reporter said, well, you know, the whole chest and everything, the shoulder blades and the scapula and all that, that's all missing. I said, how do you know all this area that's missing? How do you know it looked like that? And the artist said an amazing thing. He said, well, it is missing, but we know what humans look like, and we know what apes look like, and we know that this should look halfway between the two. And so that's how I drew it, and that's how I sculpted. Really? Well, if you're going to assume evolution is true and use that assumption to fabricate evidence that has no physical correspondence, then you can't use that evidence to prove evolution, because you use the assumption of evolution to build the halfway creature that they assume exists. I mean, he said outright, well, I made it look halfway between apes and humans. Well, that was at least an honest admission. I doubt they're going to put that in the textbooks. I doubt it. Furthermore, it's distorted. Notice how short the leg bones are here, typical of apes, short legs, right? Notice the leg bones here are noticeably longer than the real bones. Anybody have a problem seeing that? It's longer. I guess we were all born yesterday. We can't even judge distance or anything with our eyes. It's insulting to do that. For crying out loud, we can see the bone and we can see the reconstruction. They don't match up. It's insulting to us. Please don't insult us, I tell them. You see this ear? It's not a garbage can. Don't stick your garbage in my ear. It's not respectful. And don't give me garbage like this and tell me I have to believe it when it's obviously fraudulent. And they even admit the missing parts they put in based on their assumption that it evolved and it looks halfway between an ape and a man, even though the evidence is not there. Now, in the flesh reconstruction, again, what did they put in the eyes? Whites. Yeah. Remember the famous cry at Bunker Hill, don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes? Well, if apes are attacking you, you'd never shoot because they have no whites in their eyes, okay? But they put whites there to make it look more human. You can't see it here, but it gave it human-like breasts. Apes do not have human-like breasts, but they gave this one human-like breasts to make, again, this psychological warfare. It has eyes like a human, it has breasts like a human, even though we don't find that in the fossil record. So it gives that idea it's half human, half ape. And it is deceptive. It is not education, it is deceit. William Youngers, an evolutionist anatomist at Stony Brook University, commenting on this, he said, "This is a fascinating skeleton, but based on what they present, the evidence for bipedality, in other words, walking upright in two legs in a human fashion, is limited at best. Divergent big toes are associated with grasping, and this has one of the most divergent big toes you can imagine. Why would an animal fully adapted to support its weight on its forelimbs in the trees elect to walk bipedally on the ground?" Very good question. Ever try walking on your hands? I actually could do that when I was younger. I didn't do it very long because it was painful after a while. Your hands aren't designed to be walked on. And this creature would have the same problem. If it tried to walk on those feet that look like hands, it would be painful very quickly and wouldn't work very well. So, in conclusion, we find the evolutionary tree of life in our textbooks. And this, again, is a form of psychological warfare. Well, we can see the single cell evolve into the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and all the way up to human beings. Here it is in a science book, it must be true. Well, not unless it has evidence. Now, every tree has to have something it grows from. What's that? A seed. Can't get a tree out of nothing. It has to have a seed to grow from. Oh, they've got that all settled. It came from the first living cell. Or did it? As we pointed out before, to this day, they cannot account for that first seed in this tree. The first living cell is more complex than any machine man has ever dreamed of creating, much less succeeded at. It's mathematically, chemically, physically, thermodynamically impossible based on what we know, not what we don't know, and all the experiments have failed miserably. So there's no scientific basis to believe it other than they want to. So we can't account for the seed. What about the trunk of the tree that holds up all the other branches? There's no trunk. Why? Because between single cells and multimillion cell creatures, nothing, not a trace of evolutionary ancestors or transcendents, nothing. Inconceivable if all that evolution happened, but the whole trunk is missing out of this tree. So we have no seed, and we have no trunk. What about the rest of it? Stephen Gould of Harvard, expert in the fossil record, he admitted the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. Not, however, reasonable. It's not the evidence of fossils. Well, you know, science isn't based on inference. It's based on concrete evidence like fossils. He admits we don't have concrete evidence, but we have a lot of faith in evolution. So those branches, according to him, aren't based on concrete evidence. They don't exist in the concrete world. They exist in their imagination. So you have to ask yourself the question, if it's a real tree, how could it grow when there's no seed, no trunk to support the branches, and not even any branches? What we actually see is what the Bible declares. Each distinct family, each distinct kind was separately created. They didn't have an evolutionary ancestry, therefore there are no transitions connecting them. It's exactly what you'd expect to see if biblical creation is literally true. Finally, we're going to look at 4 textbook frauds quickly to wrap it up here. And these are still in our textbooks, even though they are definitely frauds and should be taken out. Now here we have the Drosophila melanogaster fruit fly, which this poor creature has been tortured in experiments for decades now. They're easy to feed, easy to grow, they have a rapid turnover in their life cycle, and so they bombarded these things with gamma rays and X-rays, and increasing the naturally occurring mutation rate 15,000%, so that in decades you could have the equivalent, of perhaps tens of thousands of years of evolution. They actually thought, boy, we'd see it evolve into an entirely different type of creature. Well, it did evolve in a way, deformed, weak, crippled, sterile, diseased. Even the ones that looked okay could not compete with the natural wild variety. They were always fundamentally weaker. So this disproves their idea that mutations are the basis of evolution. It always makes things worse, just like the creationists have already said. Decades of experiments have confirmed it. But rather than eat humble pie and admit, boy, this proves evolution doesn't work, they said, oh, yes, it did, because we got this fruit fly, the 4-winged fruit fly. Isn't that amazing? Well, firstly, this has no new information in it. The information or genes for wings simply have reappeared. Same information got put in a wrong place where there's no muscles, by the way. Therefore, it has no power at all. It drags. The thing can't fly. It's a monster. I mean, it can't fly. It can't find a mate to reproduce. It'd probably just go extinct right off in the natural world, but they had to breed 3 different ones to get these mutations to come together to get the 4-winged fruit fly. Again, artificial selection to get it. And even though they get it, it's a monster that can't even fly or survive outside of the laboratory where they feed it and take care of it and try to breed it. In the real world, it would never last. But they put it in the textbooks as if, well, here we have proof of Darwinian evolution. We have proof of a failure, and they don't correctly label it as such. Now, so-called Darwin's finches, I like to call them the creator's finches because he's the one who made them, but they studied these not too long ago. They claim there's 14 different species, okay, they're in the Galapagos Islands. The evolutionists who did the research found that they all hybridized. Now, they checked, I think, 11 different varieties. The last 3 they didn't bother with, I think, on purpose, because if they can reproduce and have fertile offspring, that's the main accepted definition of the same species. In other words, there's no reason to say that they aren't different, that they're different species. They're a polymorphic species, just like dogs and cats. In other words, you get a lot of variation within the dog family and the cat family, but they're all the same species. Dogs are Canis familiaris. Yeah, there's hundreds of different breeds. Just because there's a wide variety doesn't mean they're not the same species. Well, these were proven, 11 of them anyway. The last 3, I think, they purposefully did not do, so that it wouldn't show that all of them interbreed, and therefore they're all the same species, just like dogs and cats. There's a lot of variety, but they're the same species, and therefore there's no evolution if you don't have new species, you see. But the argument they said was, well, we've noticed that we get a pretty big change in times of drought. The size of the beaks in the majority of the population, the bigger beaked birds prevail. The ones with the smaller, more delicate beaks drop off drastically because the only seeds they can find in times of drought are these big ones with a hard covering, and only the big beaked birds can bite through them and eat them. And so a lot of the ones with the smaller beaks die off. And they said, you know, when this happens, it goes up like this, and if this were to continue for just, you know, a couple hundred years or so, there'd be enough difference we could call it a new species. Really? Now, just because it does that for a short time doesn't mean it's going to keep going like this. The real fact is that it goes up and down like this in times of drought, and then you get more rain, drought, more rain, goes in cycles. And so it goes up and down around a medium and not straight up like this. Now, if you presented something like this in a stock, you'd go to prison for stock fraud because they would say you're not giving full disclosure of all the facts. When you say, well, look, if our stock continues like this, you know, in the next, 5 or 10 years, you're going to quadruple your money or whatever, and you don't point out the fact that in the past, it never stayed up like this. It always went up and down, and that it never went very high at all. And therefore, if you don't give full disclosure, that's called stock fraud. Well, these guys have done the same thing, same trick, saying, well, look at this, if it just continues, yeah, but there's no evidence it ever did or ever has. And therefore, again, it's psychological warfare with the students, trying to make them think, look, we have proof, it's observable, look what we have. Well, we have something that would throw you in prison if you did it with the stock market. It's not very convincing evidence. Now, embryological recapitulation. Darwin said that embryological recapitulation was, quote, second to none as a proof for his theory. The idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In other words, the embryo in the womb recapitulates or goes through stages of its phylogenetic evolutionary history. Now, they claim, for example, the human embryo has gill slits, and that's a throwback to the time when we were fish. And it has a yolk sac, back to the time when we were birds. It had eggs with a yolk, and even a tail, back to the time when we were lizards or perhaps a monkey or something. And so we have these vestiges of our former evolutionary transition. Now, the problem with this is that it's based on fraud. Ernst Haeckel, who was a great disciple of Charles Darwin and did much to promote Darwinian evolution in the late 1800s, he was a supposed scientist and an artist, and he deliberately drew pictures that were fraudulent to promote this idea. He figured the end justifies the means. People got to believe in evolution, so I'll make some fraudulent pictures. Well, it turns out that we now know that these arguments are completely bogus because all of these are not useless vestiges. They actually have purposes. These folds here are actually folds in the skin. They aren't slits, and they have no respiratory tissue, so they cannot be called gills. If they're not slits and they're not gills, you can't call them gill slits. It's just deceptive. I mean, when you bend your neck forward, especially as you get older, you get double chin or even a triple chin. Well, at this point, the spine is so bent over that you get some of those folds. That's all it is. But eventually, these never turn into anything like respiratory tissue or gills. They're pharyngeal throat pouches, and they turn into the thymus gland, the parathyroids, and the middle ear canals. Never anything like gills. The so-called yolk sac is, again, just a superficial appearance. You know, if I saw a cloud in the sky, I say, that cloud looks like a teddy bear, that other cloud looks like a camel. That means that teddy bears and camels evolved from clouds based on superficial appearance. It's not a valid argument. But this is not an egg yolk. This is a blood-forming sac because this early on in the development, the bones cannot produce blood like they do later on in development. So you need something that does it in the intermediate time. It's a very good design feature, but if you cut that off, the embryo would die because it's essential. It's not a useless leftover vestige. The tail is supposed to be, you know, the coccyx, the tailbone. Again, a prejudicial name. It implies that it was once a tail or a remnant of a tail. It's actually the coccyx, the end of the spine. Well, you know the spine does have to end somewhere. It can't go on forever. And it's not a tail because it curves inward, not outward like tails. Furthermore, it's not useless. It is the anchor source for important bones in the pelvic area. And therefore, if you get cancer or something and they have to take off your coccyx, you find you can't sit comfortably for the rest of your life. It was that important. And you can't control your bowel movements, which, you know, you have to wear adult diapers the rest of your life. So I tell the evolutionists, you really believe that's a useless vestige? Put your money where your mouth is. Go have the surgery, have yours removed, and then find out you can't sit comfortably the rest of your life and get up here in your adult diapers and tell us that you really didn't need it. Yeah, no, we need it. It is important, it is useful. None of these arguments are valid at all. Now, W.J. Bach, an evolutionist embryologist in Science magazine, clear back in 1969, he said, the biogenetic law, another name for embryological recapitulation, has become so deeply rooted in biological thought that it cannot be weeded out in spite of its having been demonstrated to be wrong by numerous subsequent scholars. See, something that Darwin once called second to none as a proof for evolution, to admit that's wrong, then how wrong was he about everything else? You know, if that's supposed to be the most important and it's fraudulent, then just how much on the ball did he really have? Now, M.K. Richardson, an embryologist from England, I believe, he was curious as to just how fraudulent the drawings of Ernst Haeckel really were. He said, we know they're fraudulent. He admitted it in a university trial that it was fraudulent. But he basically said, well, other professors do fraudulent things too, so don't just pick on me. You know? As if, you know, it doesn't matter if you do things wrong, as long as other people do it too, it's okay. You know? But this was his drawings for the fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit, and human. Notice they're all very similar. This is supposed to show, see, we all came from a common ancestor that was very similar, and that's why the embryos in all these different variety of creatures look so similar to begin with. But they don't. It's a fraud. What do they actually look like? These are the actual photographs M.K. Richardson published of what they really look like at these stages. They're not even similar at all, not even close. It's one of the most egregious forms of fraud ever perpetrated in the history of science, and yet we still can't get it out of the textbooks. They even tried lawsuits to get it out. You know, some states have laws that says everything put in a science textbook has to be factual. But when they brought a case and said, hey, this has been disproven, they said, well, there's plenty of evolutionists today say it's true, so we're going to listen to them, not to you. The courts will not give justice or truth in many cases. And so it's still in there, even though it is a blatant fraud. So M.K. Richardson himself said, the core scientific issue remains unchanged. Haeckel's drawings of 1874 are substantially fabricated. In support of this view, I note that his oldest quote-unquote fish image is made up of bits and pieces from different animals, some of them mythical. It is not unreasonable to characterize this as faking. Sadly, it is the discredited 1874 drawings that are used in so many British and American biology textbooks today. And they're today in the 21st century because we can't get rid of it, because if we got rid of all the frauds, you know what would happen? You go to the chapter on evidence for evolution in a modern biology textbook, and you'd open it up, and each page would be blank. If all the frauds were taken out, there'd be nothing. And they don't want it to look like that, so they keep it in to give the facade that they actually have something. Finally, we come to one of the biggest frauds of all time, the peppered moths. Supposedly, with the Industrial Revolution in England, the soot from all the industry was causing tree trunks and rocks to get dark. And we always had two different varieties of the same moth species, Biston betullaria, the peppered moth. There was a light variety and a dark variety, but they're the same species, interbreed, same species. But they said, all of a sudden, they noticed that the light variety was diminishing and the dark variety was increasing. There's a shift in population frequency, more dark than light. Oh, what could happen? Could this be evolution? Could this be natural selection? And so they said, well, what it is the dark environment has now made the light one stick out like a sore thumb, and the dark one is camouflaged. So natural selection favors the camouflaged one. Therefore, the birds are eating more of these and leaving these instead. And so there's a shift in population based on natural selection, survival of the fittest. Even if that were true, so what? Have they changed into a different species? No, they're still the same species, Biston betullaria. Does that explain how moths evolved from a moth insect? No. I mean, the real critical questions of evolution, all it explains, if you have better camouflage, you don't get eaten by birds as much. Well, who would disagree with that? But how does that prove Darwinian evolution? And where does the change in species take place? Nothing. But even that is a fraud, because this that has been taught to tens of millions of students over generations was actually dead moths glued onto trees. See, they couldn't find the moths that were supposed to be resting on the tree trunks and the rocks. The moths had enough sense to hide during the day, maybe up in the leaves of trees somewhere, but they weren't sitting out in the open where they could get picked off by birds. But they figured the end justifies the means. This is a good story for natural selection. So they took dead moths, pinned them on the trees, and photographed the birds coming and picking them off the trees. Well, isn't that nice? In a case where they had motion picture photography, they had moths that were laboratory bred, again, because they couldn't find them in the wild. Neither could the birds during the day. And they were so lethargic, they took them out of, like refrigeration. And so they were so lethargic, they wouldn't even fly, and they would just put them on the trees, and the birds would come in and eat them. Well, of course they would, because they're visible. But the smart ones, the real ones that weren't laboratory bred, were hiding somewhere where even we couldn't find them. So they figured this whole staged event was okay because we have to indoctrinate students in the fact of evolution, and if we have to fudge a little, who cares? The end justifies the means. But it was a terrible fraud. Jerry Coyne, a notable evolutionist, said when he found this out, he had the same sinking feeling he had when he found out that Santa Claus wasn't real. It's such a good story. To find out it's not real is pretty bad. Well, of course, now they claim they're going to prove it anyway and everything. Even if it was true, what does it prove? Nothing. Natural selection, fine. If you're more camouflaged, you survive better. Who cares? It doesn't show where moths evolved from non-moths, nor has it shown a change in species. Therefore, it's irrelevant even if it were true. But it just goes to show how willing they are to perpetrate fraud, because to them, the end justifies the means. So in conclusion, we find nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of the theory of evolution. That was what Theodosius Dobzhansky was famous for saying. I would say something else. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of the evidence, which is sorely lacking when we cross-examine their best arguments in the textbooks. And finally, I would say nothing in biology makes sense except outside of explaining the origin of information and machines. Because we're not ignorant like Darwin today. We know the thing that makes life tick and work at the molecular level in all life forms is the complex interaction between blueprint information that some author put there that specifies how everything is supposed to run in an incredibly complex and amazing way for growth, metabolism, self-maintenance, and reproduction. All written out, and robotic machines can read that blueprint and understand it and build the whole world of biology based on it. That is something we can explain. We can prove in any laboratory any day of the week, intelligence can produce information. We can prove intelligence can produce complex machines like robots. Where is the proof that it happens any other way? And if they have no proof, they have nothing valid to say about biological origins, because that's what you got to explain. If you can't explain that, you're not even at square one in biology today. Darwin didn't even know we had to explain that. Back in his day, it was unknown. But we're not ignorant like Darwin. In the 21st century, we have the upper hand. I tell them, come back when you can explain the most basic thing in biology, information and machines, then we can have a discussion. But until you do, I really don't want to hear about it. Why waste my time with a theory that can't explain the two most important things? So, in conclusion, I do have this available on DVD, back at the table, as well as many other DVDs. But at this time, do you want to come forward, Chris? And we'll go ahead and close this out. And thank you very much.
We need to take up a quick offering. Again, if If you can help us, that would be awesome. Make out checks payable to Cedar Park. This goes to Cedar Park, but is used to support our speaker honorariums. Mike, would you give us a hand there? Do you mind? Let me just offer up a prayer for the offering. Father, we thank you so much for Dr. Kindell and his effort in coming to share this material with us. Father, we just ask for your blessing upon him and his ministry, Father, that you would give him many opportunities to speak, many opportunities to share the truth of your creation, Father, and furthering the ministry of Jesus Christ on this in our time. Father, we praise you and we thank you in all things we ask in Christ's name. Amen. So let me remind everyone what's happening next week. Next Wednesday, same time, I'm going to be doing a talk on Mount St. Helens. Then in May, we have Mike Riddle coming in from Indiana, so look forward to Mike Riddle coming. I haven't yet sent out a speaker invitation for April, I'll have to admit that, so, but I'll get on it. I'll get on it and get a speaker set up. But did I do a good job? Do we bring in some great speakers? Dr. Kindell's awesome, right? I just love the summary comments. Yeah. Definitely need to model him a little better with my own messages. That's what I'm thinking. And you guys are probably saying, yes, you do. Yes, you do. All right, so there's still coffee in the back. Don't run off. Dr. Kindell will be here to a chance to answer some questions. Check out his DVDs on the back table. There's some more resources there. Again, still drain the rest of that coffee pot if you can. Dr. Kindell, would you close us in a word of prayer, please?
Father, we thank you in Jesus' name, Lord, for the opportunity to study your truth. Your word tells us that the whole universe is filled with miracles. If we define miracles as things that can't happen by naturalism, they're supernatural, and they can't happen by human ingenuity, they're superhuman. Every living creature is a miracle. And anyone who says, I just believe if I could see a miracle, is without excuse. They're all around us, Lord. Help us to be able to seal these truths in our heart. Help us to remember these things. Help us to be able to share our faith, Lord, with conviction and with power. Help us to be a tool of your Holy Spirit, Lord, to reach the lost that are so deceived and been so lied to. We pray in Jesus' name, Lord, that we'll have a greater grasp of who you are, how powerful, how wonderful, how loving you are, how amazing you are, and that we'd be able to share that truth with a lost and dying world that is largely in rebellion against its Creator. But Lord, we thank you that we can be your ambassadors. We thank you that we do have the truth. We don't have to be ashamed. We don't have to back down to anyone. Nobody has the truth like Christianity, and we need to stand strong in that conviction in these last days. We pray you'll help us to do that, Lord, and to be obedient to your word, to earnestly contend for the gospel in these last days, to refute the gainsayers, and to give an answer to every man who asks a reason for the hope that is within us. And we give you thanks and praise for that in Jesus' name. Amen.